The November rain hammered against the cracked windows of the Crown Heights apartment with the relentless rhythm of disappointment. Each drop a small reminder that even the weather seemed determined to make life harder for those already struggling. Samuel Washington sat in the corner of what used to be the living room, now converted into his makeshift bedroom, listening to his daughter-in-law Keisha's voice carry through the thin walls as she complained to someone on the phone about their situation. At 62, Samuel had never imagined he'd be living in his son's one-bedroom apartment, sleeping on a pull-out couch that had seen better decades, trying to make himself invisible while tensions simmered around him like steam from an overheated radiator. The stroke 18 months ago had changed everything: his independence, his dignity, his understanding of where he belonged in a world that suddenly felt foreign and unwelcoming. "I'm telling you, Mama, this can't go on much longer." Keisha's voice drifted from the kitchen, sharp with frustration and loud enough to ensure Samuel heard every word. "We got no privacy, no space, and Damon's acting like I'm supposed to be happy about taking care of his daddy when we can barely take care of ourselves." Samuel shifted on the uncomfortable couch, his left side still weak from the stroke that had stolen his construction job, his savings, and apparently his welcome in his own son's home. Before the medical emergency, he'd been the one helping out, slipping Damon money when the rent was late, bringing groceries when work was slow, babysitting his grandchildren when Keisha needed to pick up extra shifts at the hospital where she worked as a nurse's aide. Now he was the problem that needed solving, the burden that complicated their already strained marriage, the old leech that Keisha thought he couldn't hear her calling him when she assumed he was asleep. The apartment was cramped even without Samuel's presence. One bedroom, one bathroom, a kitchen barely large enough for two people to pass each other, and a living room that now served triple duty as his bedroom, the children's play area, and the only space where Damon and Keisha could watch television. The walls were thin enough that every conversation became public, every argument echoed through the building, every moment of tension amplified by proximity and the grinding stress of too many people in too little space. Samuel heard the front door open, followed by the sound of his son's heavy footsteps and the rustle of work clothes that still carried the smell of the shipping warehouse where Damon worked double shifts to make ends meet. At 38, Damon looked older than his years, worn down by the weight of supporting a family while watching his father transform from provider to dependent. "Daddy, you awake?" Damon's voice carried the careful neutrality that had become their standard communication. Not cold exactly, but lacking the warmth that had once characterized their relationship. Samuel opened his eyes, noting how his son stood in the doorway rather than entering the room, maintaining distance that felt both protective and rejective. "Yeah, son. Just resting. How you feeling today? Any better?" The question was asked with genuine concern, but Samuel heard the underlying hope, the wish that better might eventually mean independent, self-sufficient, no longer requiring the financial and emotional support that was slowly crushing his son's marriage. "About the same. Left side still weak, but the doctor says that might improve with time." Damon nodded, though they both knew that might was doing heavy lifting in that sentence. 18 months of physical therapy had yielded modest improvements, but nothing approaching the recovery that would allow Samuel to return to construction work or live independently. The disability payments covered his medications, but little else, leaving him financially dependent on a son who was already struggling to support his own family. "Keisha's in the kitchen starting dinner," Damon said, his tone suggesting this was both information and warning. "Maybe you could—" "I don't know. Maybe watch TV with the kids in the bedroom while we eat. Give us a little family time." The request was reasonable, phrased politely, but it carried the sting of exclusion that Samuel felt more acutely with each passing day. He was family, but not family, present but not included, tolerated but not welcomed. Of course, son, I understand. But understanding and accepting were different things. Samuel understood that his presence complicated their lives, strained their marriage, and created financial pressure they couldn't afford. He understood that Keisha worked 12-hour shifts and came home to a house where she couldn't relax because her father-in-law was always there, always needing something, always serving as a reminder that their small apartment wasn't really their own. What he couldn't understand was when he'd stopped being Damon's father and become just another problem to manage. The children, Malik, 8, and Zara, 6, provided the only bright spots in Samuel's increasingly dark days. They still ran to him with scraped knees and homework questions, still climbed onto his lap to hear stories about the Brooklyn of his childhood, still saw their grandfather as someone worth loving rather than someone to be endured. "Papa Sam, why do you sleep in the living room?" Zara had asked the previous week, her 6-year-old directness cutting through the careful politeness that the adults used to avoid acknowledging the obvious. "Because your mama and daddy need their bedroom, baby girl. But where do you live? This isn't your house." The question had hit Samuel like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the reality that even his grandchildren could see. He was a guest in their space, not a family member in his own home, because this wasn't his home and never would be. The dinner preparations began with the familiar sounds of domesticity. Pots clattering, cabinet doors closing, Keisha moving through the kitchen with the efficient irritation of someone performing unwelcome duties. Samuel gathered his medications from the coffee table that served as his nightstand, retreating to the bedroom, where Malik was sprawled on the floor, playing video games, and Zara was coloring at the small desk they'd squeezed between the bed and the window. "Papa Sam, sit with us," Malik called without looking up from his game. "You can help me beat this level." Samuel settled carefully on the edge of the bed, his balance still uncertain, watching his grandson navigate digital challenges with the confidence that only children possessed. Through the thin walls, he could hear Damon and Keisha's conversation growing heated, their voices carrying the edge that came with stress and sleep deprivation, and the grinding pressure of too many needs competing for too few resources. "I can't keep doing this, Damon." Keisha's voice was sharp, tired, carrying 2 years of accumulated frustration. "I work all day, come home to cook dinner for 5 people in a kitchen meant for 2, and then have to pretend like everything's normal while your father listens to every conversation we have." "What do you want me to do, Keisha? Put him in a home? With what money? You want me to abandon my father when he needs help?" "I want you to figure out something that doesn't destroy our marriage. I want to be able to have a private conversation with my husband without whispering. I want our kids to have a normal home instead of feeling like they're living in a nursing home." Samuel closed his eyes, feeling the weight of being discussed like a problem to be solved rather than a person deserving consideration. The children seemed oblivious to the tension, lost in their activities. But Samuel knew they absorbed every harsh word, every moment of conflict that his presence generated. "Maybe I should look into other options," Damon said quietly, and Samuel's heart clenched at the defeat in his son's voice. "What other options? Your cousin Jerome's place. He's got 3 kids and no spare room. Your Aunt Betty's house? She's barely managing her own bills. Face it, Damon, there are no good options because we can't afford good options." The conversation continued, covering familiar territory with increasing bitterness. Samuel was too expensive to maintain, too incapacitated to live alone, too proud to accept charity from the church, and too poor to afford assisted living. He existed in a space between independence and dependence that satisfied no one and solved nothing. Later that evening, after the children were asleep and the apartment had settled into the uneasy quiet that passed for peace, Samuel lay on his pull-out couch, listening to the sounds of his son's marriage slowly dissolving under the pressure of his unwanted presence. Damon and Keisha argued in whispers now, their voices carrying through the walls with the intensity of people trying to scream without being heard. The stroke had taken more than his physical abilities. It had stolen his sense of purpose, his independence, and his place in the family structure that had defined his identity for 62 years. Before the medical emergency, he'd been the patriarch, the provider, the man his son called for advice and support. Now he was the burden, the complication, the father who'd become a child requiring care he couldn't afford and attention his family couldn't spare. Samuel stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of being unwanted in the most fundamental way possible. He wasn't just inconvenient, he was actively damaging the lives of the people he loved most. His presence was poison, slowly killing his son's marriage and robbing his grandchildren of the peaceful home they deserved. But where else could he go? The disability payments barely covered his medications. The construction work that had defined his adult life was physically impossible now. The friends who might have offered temporary shelter were dealing with their own aging bodies, their own financial struggles, their own children who viewed elderly parents as expensive obligations rather than honored family members. At 62, Samuel Washington was learning that growing old without money in America meant becoming a burden that no one wanted to carry, a problem that no one wanted to solve, a person whose value had diminished to the point where love felt like duty and family felt like imprisonment. The rain continued to hammer against the windows, each drop a reminder that even the weather seemed determined to make life harder for those who were already struggling. And in the corner of the living room that served as his bedroom, Samuel Washington closed his eyes and wondered what would happen to a man who'd run out of places to go and people willing to take him in. Tomorrow would bring another day of careful politeness, whispered arguments, and the grinding tension of too many people sharing too little space. But tonight, Samuel simply lay in the darkness, listening to his family discuss his unwanted presence and wondering when he'd stopped being a father worth keeping and become a burden worth discarding. The December cold seeped through the old windows of the Crown Heights apartment like unwelcome truth, and Samuel Washington pulled his thin blanket closer around his shoulders as he listened to Keisha pace the kitchen floor at 6 in the morning. Her 12-hour shift at Brooklyn Methodist started at 7, which meant she was already running behind schedule, a fact she blamed on the complications of sharing one bathroom with 4 other people, including an elderly man whose medications made morning routines unpredictable. "Damon, I swear to God, if your father's pills are still scattered all over the bathroom counter when I get home tonight, I'm going to lose my mind." Keisha's voice carried the sharp edge of someone operating on 3 hours of sleep and infinite frustration. "I can't even brush my teeth without moving his prescription bottles." Samuel heard his son's muffled response from the bedroom, something conciliatory and apologetic that didn't address the deeper problem, that his presence had transformed their small apartment into a battlefield where every square inch was contested territory. Every daily routine a source of potential conflict. The past month had brought a series of small disasters that had escalated the household tension to breaking point. Samuel's fall in the bathroom 2 weeks ago, though minor, had required a trip to the emergency room that ate up Damon's vacation day and resulted in medical bills they couldn't afford. The incident had also left Samuel even more cautious about moving around the apartment, which meant he spent longer periods on the pull-out couch that dominated their living space. "Kids, get dressed." "We're running late," Keisha called, her voice carrying the controlled panic of someone juggling too many responsibilities with insufficient resources. Samuel could hear Malik and Zara moving around the bedroom, their morning routine complicated by the fact that their grandfather's medical equipment and personal belongings had gradually expanded into their already cramped living space. The walker, the blood pressure monitor, the pill organizer, the compression socks hanging on the radiator, all necessary items that served as constant reminders of the disruption his presence created. "Papa Sam, where are my shoes?" Zara's voice was plaintive, confused by the daily chaos that had become their normal. "Check under the couch, baby girl," Samuel called back, knowing that the furniture that served as his bed had become a magnet for lost items in their overcrowded living space. He struggled to sit up, his morning stiffness more pronounced in the cold apartment, and began the careful process of folding his bedding and converting the living room back into a shared family space. The routine felt like an act of erasure, removing all evidence of his presence so that his son's family could pretend for a few hours that they lived in a normal home. Through the thin walls, he could hear Damon getting ready for work, the sounds of a man moving through his morning routine with mechanical efficiency rather than enthusiasm. His son's job at the warehouse was physically demanding and emotionally deadening, but it provided the health insurance that covered Samuel's medications and the steady income that kept them housed and fed, if not comfortable. "Daddy, Keisha's crying in the kitchen." Malik appeared in the doorway, his 8-year-old face serious with the kind of premature wisdom that comes from living in houses where adults' emotions are too big for the space available. Samuel felt his chest tighten with guilt. His grandson shouldn't have to report on his grandmother's emotional state, shouldn't have to navigate the tension that his grandfather's presence created, shouldn't have to grow up in a home where financial stress and spatial constraints made every day feel like a crisis. "Go brush your teeth, son. Let the grown-ups handle grown-up problems." But Malik lingered in the doorway, studying his grandfather with the careful attention of a child trying to understand forces beyond his control. "Papa Sam, why doesn't everyone want you here?" The question hit Samuel like a physical blow. He looked at his grandson, this beautiful boy with his father's eyes and his mother's stubborn chin, and struggled to find words that were honest without being devastating. Sometimes when people are tired and worried about money, they say things they don't mean. "Your mama and daddy love you and Zara very much, and they're doing their best to take care of everyone." "But do they love you?" Samuel paused, considering how to answer a question that cut to the heart of his current situation. Did they love him? Probably. But love and want weren't the same thing, and Malik was old enough to sense the difference. "They love me, baby boy, but love is complicated when people are stressed and don't have enough space or money." Malik nodded with the gravity of someone processing information too complex for his age, then disappeared to follow his grandfather's instructions about teeth brushing. Samuel sat on the edge of his pull-out couch, feeling the weight of being a burden that even children could identify, a disruption so obvious that 8-year-olds noticed the tension his presence created. Keisha emerged from the kitchen, wearing her scrubs and the expression of someone barely holding herself together. She moved through the living room without acknowledging Samuel's presence, gathering her work bag and keys with the efficient desperation of someone running late for a job she couldn't afford to lose. "Damon, I'm leaving," she called toward the bedroom. "The kids need to be at school by 8:15. Your father's pills are on the kitchen counter. Make sure he takes them before you leave for work." The reminder stung, though it was practical and necessary. Samuel's medication routine was complex enough that skipping doses could result in dangerous complications, but having his son's wife manage his health care felt like another small surrender of independence and dignity. After the family left for work and school, Samuel found himself alone in the apartment for the first time in weeks. The silence was both blessing and curse, relief from the constant tension, but also a reminder of how isolated his life had become. The stroke had cost him not just his job, but his social connections, his independence, and his sense of purpose. He moved carefully to the kitchen, noting how Keisha had cleaned around his medical supplies, with the kind of aggressive efficiency that suggested resentment disguised as helpfulness. The refrigerator was covered with Malik and Zara's school papers, family photos from happier times, and appointment cards for doctors Samuel couldn't afford to see as often as he should. The phone rang at 10:30. Jerome, his nephew, calling with the kind of concern that felt both genuine and obligatory. "Uncle Sam, how you holding up?" "I'm managing, Jerome. Just taking it one day at a time." "Listen, I've been talking to Betty about your situation. She thinks maybe there might be some options we ain't considered yet." Samuel felt his heart rate accelerate with something between hope and dread. Options usually meant changes, and changes in his current situation likely meant displacement rather than improvement. What kind of options? Well, there's this place in Queens. Assisted living, but not too expensive. Betty thinks you might qualify for some kind of state assistance to help with the cost. Assisted living. The phrase carried weight that Samuel wasn't ready to accept. The final surrender of independence, the acknowledgement that he was no longer capable of managing his own life, the transition from family member to resident of an institutional facility. "Jerome, I appreciate you looking into things, but I'm not ready for that yet." "Uncle Sam, I hear you, but Damon's struggling, man. Keisha's about ready to leave him over this situation. You got to consider what's best for everybody involved." "Dees." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering familiar territory with increasing urgency. Jerome painted a picture of family dynamics stretched to breaking point, of marriages endangered by financial pressure, of children growing up in houses where adult stress dominated every interaction. After hanging up, Samuel sat in the quiet apartment, feeling the weight of decisions he didn't want to make about a future he couldn't afford. The assisted living facility Jerome had mentioned would cost more than his disability payments covered, even with state assistance. But staying with Damon and Keisha was slowly destroying their family, turning his presence into a source of daily conflict and long-term resentment. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor, Mrs. Chen from the apartment upstairs, carrying a container of soup and the kind of gentle concern that reminded Samuel there were still people in the world who saw him as a person worth caring about rather than a problem to be solved. "Mr. Washington, I heard you've been having some health troubles. Thought you might like some soup." Mrs. Chen was 78. A widow who'd been living in the building for 15 years and had watched families come and go with the observer's eye of someone who'd seen most of life's variations on struggle and survival. She settled carefully onto the couch across from Samuel's makeshift bed, her presence bringing a momentary relief from the isolation that had become his constant companion. "Mrs. Chen, you're too kind. You don't need to be checking on me." "Nonsense! We're neighbors. Besides, I know what it's like to feel like you're in the way all the time." The observation was delivered with the casual honesty of someone old enough to speak uncomfortable truths without apology. Samuel studied her face, seeing recognition of shared experience in her expression. "You understand this situation? I lived with my daughter and her family for 3 years after my husband died. Same problems, not enough space, not enough money, too much stress for everyone involved. Love ain't always enough when circumstances are working against you." Mrs. Chen's words carried the weight of lived experience, the wisdom of someone who'd navigated similar challenges without easy solutions or happy endings. "What did you do?" "Found this apartment when the rent was still reasonable. Been here ever since, close enough to help with the grandchildren, but far enough away that my daughter and her husband can have their own lives." Samuel felt a spike of something between hope and despair. Mrs. Chen's solution required resources he didn't have, the ability to afford rent, to live independently, to maintain the kind of self-sufficiency that his stroke had stolen from him. "Mrs. Chen, I appreciate the visit, but I don't have the options you had. Can't work anymore, can't afford my own place, can't take care of myself the way I used to. I know, baby. But sometimes solutions come from places we don't expect. Sometimes help arrives when we stop looking for it. She stayed for another hour, sharing stories about the building's history, the families who'd struggled and survived in these small apartments, the community networks that sustained people through difficulties that seemed insurmountable. Her presence reminded Samuel that he was still a person worth visiting, still someone whose company had value beyond the practical complications his care required. That evening, the family returned home carrying the accumulated stress of their respective days. Damon exhausted from warehouse work, Keisha emotionally drained from hospital shifts, the children cranky from too many hours of institutional care. The apartment felt smaller with everyone present, the air thick with unspoken resentments and carefully managed frustrations. Dinner was a quiet affair, conversation limited to necessary exchanges about homework and schedules and the logistical challenges of coordinating 4 people's needs in space designed for 2. Samuel ate carefully, trying not to spill anything that would add to Keisha's cleaning responsibilities, trying not to make noise that would draw attention to his presence. "Daddy, Miss Johnson says we need to bring something for the holiday party at school," Zara announced, her 6-year-old voice bright with excitement about celebrations that felt distant from their current reality. Keisha and Damon exchanged glances, the kind of quick-loaded communication that passes between parents when children make requests that strain already stretched budgets. "We'll figure something out, baby," Damon said, but his voice carried the weariness of someone who'd been figuring things out for too long with too few resources. Samuel felt the familiar weight of being an expensive burden in a household where every dollar mattered, where his medical bills and care needs competed with his grandchildren's school supplies and holiday celebrations. His presence didn't just complicate their space, it compromised their ability to provide the kind of childhood experiences that Malik and Zara deserved. Later that night, after the children were asleep and the apartment had settled into its usual pattern of whispered arguments and suppressed frustrations, Samuel lay on his pull-out couch, staring at the ceiling and contemplating the impossible mathematics of his situation. He couldn't afford to leave, couldn't afford to stay, couldn't work enough to contribute meaningfully to household expenses, and couldn't stop needing the medical care and daily assistance that his family couldn't afford to provide. He existed in a space between independence and dependence that satisfied no one and solved nothing, a living reminder that growing old without money in America meant becoming a burden that love alone couldn't make bearable. Through the thin walls, he could hear Damon and Keisha's nightly discussion of their impossible circumstances, their voices carrying the strain of people trapped in a situation with no good options. And Samuel Washington closed his eyes, knowing that tomorrow would bring another day of careful politeness, masking deeper resentments, another 24 hours of being unwanted in the only place he had left to go. The 3rd Saturday in December arrived with the kind of bitter Brooklyn wind that found every crack in the old windows and reminded everyone that winter had settled in for a long stay. Samuel Washington sat in his corner of the living room, watching his family prepare for what should have been a celebration, Malik's 9th birthday party, but felt more like a logistical nightmare in their overcrowded apartment. Keisha moved through the small space with the controlled chaos of someone trying to organize a children's party in a home that barely accommodated daily life, let alone special occasions. The coffee table that served as Samuel's nightstand had been pushed against the wall to make room for folding chairs borrowed from the church. The pull-out couch where he slept was folded up but still dominated the room, an unmovable reminder that this wasn't really a party space, but someone's bedroom masquerading as a living area. "Damon, where are we supposed to put the cake table? There's literally nowhere to set anything up," Keisha's voice carried the sharp edge of someone operating on 3 hours of sleep and infinite frustration. Samuel watched his son survey their cramped living space with the expression of a man calculating impossible equations. The kitchen was too small for party food preparation. The bedroom was barely large enough for the children's bunk beds. The living room, their only common area, was dominated by Samuel's medical equipment and sleeping arrangements. "Maybe we could push Papa Sam's stuff into the bedroom for a few hours," Malik suggested, with the innocent helpfulness of a 9-year-old who didn't understand the complicated dynamics of adult space negotiation. The silence that followed was loaded with 18 months of accumulated tension. Keisha stopped arranging chairs and turned to look at Samuel with an expression that mixed exhaustion with barely controlled resentment. Damon's jaw tightened with the kind of frustration that comes from loving someone whose presence complicates everything you try to accomplish. That's a good idea, son," Damon said carefully, his voice neutral in the way that suggested dangerous emotions held in check. "Dad, would that be okay? Just for the party?" Samuel felt the familiar sting of being treated like a logistical problem rather than a family member whose presence should be welcomed at his grandson's birthday celebration. But he also understood the practical reality. His medical equipment, his walker, his pill organizer, and the accumulated debris of living in a space not designed for his needs had transformed their common area into something that looked more like a hospital room than a home. "Of course, son. Whatever makes the party easier." As Samuel began gathering his medications and personal items, he caught Keisha watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not hatred exactly, but something colder. The look of someone who'd reached the end of their capacity for accommodation and was calculating how much more they could endure. The doorbell started ringing at noon, bringing a parade of neighborhood children, parents dropping off kids, and family members arriving with gifts and well-wishes for Malik's birthday. The small apartment filled quickly, voices echoing off the thin walls, children running between the kitchen and living room in games that would have been charming in a larger space, but felt chaotic and overwhelming in their cramped quarters. Samuel retreated to the bedroom as agreed, sitting on the edge of the lower bunk bed and listening to the party sounds through the door. He could hear Malik's laughter, Zara's excited chatter, Damon's voice as he tried to coordinate party games in a space barely large enough for normal movement. But he could also hear the undertone of stress, Keisha's sharp directions about food and drinks, the sound of something breaking in the kitchen, the controlled panic of adults trying to manage too many children in too little space. "Papa, Sam, why aren't you at my party?" Malik appeared in the bedroom doorway, his face flushed with birthday excitement but confused by his grandfather's absence from the celebration. "Just giving everyone more room to have fun, baby boy. This is your special day." Malik studied his grandfather with the serious attention of a child processing adult complications beyond his understanding. "But it's not the same without you. You're supposed to be there when I blow out my candles." Before Samuel could respond, Keisha's voice cut through the party noise with an edge that made everyone in the apartment go quiet. "Malik, get back out here with your friends. Your grandfather is fine where he is." The dismissal was sharp enough to make Malik flinch, and Samuel watched his grandson's face crumple with the kind of confusion that comes from sensing adult anger without understanding its source. The boy disappeared back into the party, but the moment had shifted something in the apartment's atmosphere, a recognition that the celebration was being managed around someone's unwanted presence, rather than including everyone in the joy. 20 minutes later, Samuel heard voices raised in the kitchen, not party conversation, but the kind of heated discussion that happens when careful politeness finally breaks down under pressure. "I cannot do this anymore, Damon." Keisha's voice was loud enough to be heard over the party noise, sharp enough to cut through the careful facade they'd been maintaining. I cannot have one normal day, one celebration, one moment of peace in my own home because your father is always here, always needing something, always making everything about his problems. Samuel felt his chest tighten with shame and hurt. He understood Keisha's frustration, but hearing it voiced so bluntly at his grandson's birthday party with neighbors and family present felt like a public humiliation that exceeded anything he'd endured since the stroke had stolen his independence. Keisha, keep your voice down. People can hear you. I don't care who hears me. I'm tired of pretending this situation is working when it's destroying our family. I'm tired of having no privacy, no space, no life that isn't completely dominated by your father's needs. The party conversations in the living room had gone quiet, creating the kind of uncomfortable silence that happens when private conflicts become public spectacles. Samuel could picture the neighbors and family members exchanging glances, children sensing adult tension without understanding its source, the birthday celebration transforming into something awkward and painful. What do you want me to do? Damon's voice carried the defeat of someone who'd been asked the same question too many times without finding acceptable answers. I want you to choose, him or me, this marriage or your father. Because I cannot keep living like this, and I will not raise my children in a house where every day is a struggle just to exist. The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore or unsay. Samuel felt something break inside him. Not his heart, exactly, but his last remaining hope that love might be enough to sustain relationships under impossible circumstances. He could hear movement in the kitchen, the sound of someone leaving the apartment, a door slamming hard enough to rattle the windows. Then Damon's voice trying to restart the party energy for Malik's sake, encouraging the children to continue their games while adults worked through grown-up problems. Samuel sat on the edge of the bunk bed, staring at his hands and feeling the weight of being the problem that had just exploded their family celebration. He was the reason his grandson's birthday party had turned into a public argument. He was the burden whose presence had finally pushed his daughter-in-law beyond her breaking point. He was the father whose need for care had forced his son to choose between marriage and filial duty. The bedroom door opened quietly, and Damon appeared with the expression of someone who'd aged years in the past few minutes. "Dad, I'm sorry. Keisha didn't mean—" "Yes, she did." Samuel's voice was quiet, matter of fact. "And she's right. This situation isn't working for anyone." Damon sank into the small chair by the window, his shoulders sagging with the weight of impossible decisions. At 38, he looked like a man being crushed by forces beyond his control. Financial pressure, family obligations, the grinding stress of trying to be a good son and a good husband when those roles demanded contradictory actions. "I don't know what to do, Dad. I can't abandon you, but I can't lose my family either." Samuel looked at his son, this man who'd inherited his sense of responsibility and his stubborn loyalty, who was being torn apart by competing obligations that American society offered no good way to resolve. "Son, maybe it's time to consider that some problems don't have solutions that make everyone happy. Maybe it's time to make the hard choice that serves the greater good." "What are you saying?" Samuel took a deep breath, feeling the words form themselves around a decision he'd been avoiding but could no longer postpone. "I'm saying that my presence here is destroying your marriage and robbing your children of the peaceful home they deserve. I'm saying that sometimes love means walking away from people you care about so they can have the life they need." Through the thin walls, they could hear the party trying to restart. Malik's friends singing happy birthday with the forced enthusiasm of children who sensed something had gone wrong but didn't understand what. The sound of normal childhood celebration felt distant from the conversation happening in the bedroom, separate from the adult realities that were reshaping their family structure. "Dad, where would you go? What would you do?" "I don't know yet, but I know I can't stay here anymore. Not after today, not after what Keisha said, and not after seeing how my presence affects my grandchildren." Samuel stood up carefully, his balance still uncertain, and moved to the window that looked out over Crown Heights, the neighborhood where he'd raised Damon as a single father, where he'd built a life that made sense until the stroke stole his ability to maintain it independently. "Damon, I need you to understand something. This isn't your fault. You've been a good son, better than I had any right to expect. You took me in when I had nowhere else to go. You've provided for my medical care. You've sacrificed your family's comfort for my needs. But some sacrifices are too expensive to maintain." Father and son sat together in the small bedroom, listening to the sounds of a birthday party that had been damaged by the reality of their impossible circumstances. Outside, the December wind rattled the windows with the persistence of winter, and inside, two men who loved each other faced the brutal arithmetic of American poverty and aging, the mathematics that proved love alone wasn't enough to solve problems that required resources they didn't have and options that didn't exist. The conversation that followed was quiet, painful, necessary. They talked about assisted living facilities that cost more than Samuel's disability payments could cover. They discussed family members who might provide temporary shelter but couldn't offer long-term solutions. They explored options that ranged from inadequate to impossible, searching for answers to questions that American society hadn't bothered to address adequately. By the time the party guests had left and the apartment had returned to its usual cramped quiet, Samuel had made a decision that felt both inevitable and devastating. He was going to leave, not because he wanted to, not because he had somewhere better to go, but because his presence had become toxic to the family he loved most. The choice wasn't about finding a perfect solution. It was about accepting that some problems didn't have perfect solutions, that sometimes love meant sacrificing yourself so others could survive, and that growing old without money in America often meant choosing between being a burden and being alone. As Samuel prepared for what might be his last night on the pull-out couch in his son's living room, he reflected on the complicated mathematics of family obligation, financial limitation, and the brutal reality that good people sometimes had to make impossible choices because their society had failed to provide adequate support for its most vulnerable members. Tomorrow would bring conversations about logistics and timelines, about where he would go and how he would manage, and what would happen to a 62-year-old stroke survivor with limited mobility and no financial resources. But tonight, Samuel Washington simply lay in the darkness of his son's living room, listening to the sounds of a family trying to heal from wounds that his presence had created, and wondering if doing the right thing would kill him or set him free. The apartment settled into its usual pattern of whispered conversations and suppressed emotions, but something fundamental had shifted. The careful politeness that had masked their deeper problems had finally broken down, revealing truths that could never be unspoken, resentments that could never be forgotten, and the harsh reality that love alone wasn't enough to solve problems that required resources they didn't have and options that didn't exist. Samuel closed his eyes and tried to imagine a future that didn't include the daily humiliation of being unwanted in the only place he had left to go. The future was uncertain, frightening, filled with possibilities that ranged from inadequate to catastrophic. But it was also, for the first time in 18 months, his own. Christmas morning arrived with the kind of brutal honesty that December in Brooklyn was famous for: grey skies, bitter wind, and the unforgiving clarity that comes when illusions have been stripped away, and only truth remains. Samuel Washington sat at the kitchen table of the Crown Heights apartment, staring at the small pile of belongings he'd accumulated over 18 months of unwanted residency. A few changes of clothes, his medications, the photo albums Damon had rescued from his old apartment, and the legal documents that defined his existence as a disabled senior with limited options and unlimited needs. 3 days had passed since Malik's birthday party explosion, 3 days of careful conversations and painful logistics as the family worked through the aftermath of Keisha's ultimatum and Samuel's decision to leave. The apartment felt different now, not necessarily more comfortable, but honest in ways that the previous months of careful politeness had never been. Everyone knew where they stood, even if where they stood was on ground that satisfied no one. "Dad, you sure about this?" Damon's voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd spent 72 hours wrestling with impossible decisions. "Jerome says he can make room for a few weeks while we figure out something more permanent." Samuel looked at his son, this man who'd inherited his strong jaw and his stubborn sense of responsibility, who was being torn apart by competing obligations that had no good resolution. Jerome's offer was generous but temporary, a band-aid solution that would postpone rather than solve the fundamental problem of what happened to elderly, disabled Americans whose families couldn't afford to care for them but couldn't afford not to. Son, running from house to house, being everyone's temporary burden, that's not living, that's just dying slowly while inconveniencing as many people as possible. Keisha emerged from the bedroom, wearing the expression of someone who'd won an argument but wasn't sure the victory was worth celebrating. Her ultimatum had achieved its goal. Samuel was leaving. But the satisfaction was complicated by guilt, exhaustion, and the recognition that their problems extended far beyond his presence in their living room. "Mr. Washington," she said quietly, using the formal address that maintained distance while acknowledging respect, "I want you to know that this isn't... I never meant for things to get so difficult." Samuel studied his daughter-in-law, seeing not the enemy who'd forced his departure, but a young woman who'd been pushed beyond her capacity for accommodation by circumstances that were nobody's fault and everyone's responsibility. "Keisha, you've been carrying a load that was too heavy for anyone to bear. You've worked 12-hour shifts and come home to take care of an old man who needed more help than you had energy to provide. You've shared your home, your privacy, your family space with someone who didn't have anywhere else to go. Don't apologize for reaching your limit." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Malik and Zara, still in their Christmas morning pajamas, their faces carrying the confusion that comes from sensing adult drama without understanding its full implications. They approached their grandfather with the careful attention of children who'd learned that grown-up emotions were complicated and potentially dangerous. "Papa Sam, are you really leaving?" Zara's 6-year-old directness cut through the careful politeness the adults had been maintaining. Samuel pulled his granddaughter onto his lap, feeling the weight of having to explain adult failures to innocent children. "Yes, baby girl. Papa Sam needs to find his own place to live so your mama and daddy can have their house back." "But where will you go?" The question hung in the air like smoke, impossible to answer honestly without frightening children who deserved better than the brutal reality of American elder care. Samuel had spent 3 days calling numbers, researching options, and discovering that the gap between what he needed and what society provided was measured in thousands of dollars he didn't have and resources that didn't exist. "I'm going to figure that out, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups have to make changes, even when they don't know exactly how things will work out." Malik, with the serious attention of a 9-year-old who'd been forced to mature beyond his years, studied his grandfather's face with troubling intensity. "Papa Sam, is it because Mama doesn't want you here anymore?" The silence that followed was loaded with 18 months of accumulated tension, unspoken resentments, and the kind of truths that children absorbed even when adults tried to protect them from adult realities. Keisha's face flushed with shame and anger, Damon's jaw tightened with protective instincts, and Samuel felt the weight of being the catalyst for family dysfunction that his grandchildren would remember for the rest of their lives. "Malik," Samuel said carefully, "your mama has been working very hard to take care of everyone in this family. Sometimes when people are tired and worried about money, they need space to breathe and figure things out. This isn't about anyone not wanting anyone. It's about grown-ups trying to do what's best for everyone involved." But even as he spoke the words, Samuel knew they weren't entirely true. Want and need weren't the same thing. And while his family might love him, they clearly didn't want him in ways that made his presence sustainable or welcome. The doorbell rang at 10 o'clock, announcing the arrival of Mrs. Chen from upstairs, carrying a small wrapped package and wearing the expression of someone who'd come to witness rather than participate in family drama. "Mr. Washington, I heard you might be leaving today. Thought you should have this before you go." The package contained a small address book, handwritten entries covering decades of community connections, phone numbers for churches and social service agencies and community organizations that Mrs. Chen had accumulated during her own years of navigating Brooklyn's support networks. "Some of these numbers might help," she said quietly. "Some of these people understand what it's like to need help when the regular systems don't work." Samuel opened the address book, scanning pages of information that represented lifelines he hadn't known existed. Senior housing programs with long waiting lists but actual availability, community centers that provided meals and social services, churches that offered temporary assistance to people in transition. "Mrs. Chen, this is incredibly generous. Mr. Washington, I've been watching this family for months, seeing how everyone's struggling with a situation that don't have easy answers. Sometimes the solution isn't about fixing everything. Sometimes it's about finding something that works better than what you got now." She stayed for another hour, sharing stories about other families in the building who'd faced similar challenges, community resources that provided support without requiring the kind of financial resources that no one in their apartment possessed. Her presence reminded everyone that Samuel's situation wasn't unique, that American society was filled with people trying to navigate aging and disability without adequate support systems. By noon, Samuel had made 3 phone calls that resulted in possibilities rather than promises. A senior housing complex in Bed-Stuy had a studio apartment that might become available in February. A community center in Fort Greene offered meal programs and social services for elderly residents living independently. A church in his old neighborhood had emergency assistance funds that could help with moving expenses and first month's rent. None of the options were perfect. All of them required him to live more independently than his post-stroke condition made comfortable, but they offered something that staying with Damon and Keisha couldn't provide: the possibility of maintaining dignity while receiving necessary support. "Dad, are you sure you can manage on your own?" Damon's question carried genuine concern, mixed with barely concealed relief. "Son, I managed on my own for 60 years before the stroke. I'll figure out how to manage again, even if it looks different than it used to." The conversation that followed was practical and painful, covering logistics and timelines and the complicated emotions of family members who loved each other but couldn't live together successfully. They talked about visiting schedules and emergency contacts and the ways that physical distance might actually improve their emotional connection. As Samuel packed his few belongings into 2 small suitcases, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 18 months: anticipation mixed with terror, hope complicated by uncertainty. but most importantly, the sense that he was making a choice rather than accepting a situation imposed by other people's limitations. Keisha appeared in the doorway as he folded his last shirt, her expression mixing guilt with relief in proportions that probably matched his own emotional state. "Mr. Washington, I need to say something." Samuel paused in his packing, giving her the attention that difficult conversations required. "I know I've been hard on you. I know I said things that were cruel, treated you like you were a problem instead of family. But I need you to understand, it wasn't about you personally. It was about feeling like I was drowning in responsibilities I couldn't handle with resources I didn't have." Samuel studied his daughter-in-law, seeing not the enemy who'd forced his departure, but a young woman who'd been asked to carry more than anyone should be expected to bear. "Keisha, you took in an old man who had nowhere else to go. You shared your home, your privacy, your family space with someone who needed more help than you had energy to provide. You worked 12-hour shifts and came home to take care of children and a disabled senior citizen. Don't apologize for being human." "Oh, but I should have been kinder. I should have found ways to make it work instead of making you feel unwelcome." "Baby girl, kindness doesn't solve problems that require money and space and resources that don't exist. You did the best you could with an impossible situation. Sometimes the kindest thing is admitting when something isn't working instead of pretending it is." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering apologies and forgiveness and the complicated recognition that good people sometimes hurt each other when circumstances push everyone beyond their capacity for accommodation. By 3 o'clock Christmas afternoon, Samuel's belongings were packed, his temporary housing arrangements were confirmed, and his family had gathered in the small living room for goodbyes that felt both inevitable and devastating. Malik and Zara clung to their grandfather with the desperate affection of children who understood that adult decisions had consequences they couldn't control or fix. Damon embraced his father with the mixture of love and relief that comes from solving problems that had no good solutions. Keisha offered a handshake that carried respect if not warmth, acknowledgement of shared struggle if not shared success. "Dad," Damon said as they prepared to leave for the temporary housing, Mrs. Chen had helped arrange, "I want you to know that this doesn't mean we don't love you. This doesn't mean you're not family." Samuel looked around the apartment that had been his home for 18 months, noting how it already felt different without his medical equipment and personal belongings scattered throughout the living space. The pull-out couch looked like furniture again, rather than someone's bedroom. The coffee table could serve its intended purpose rather than functioning as a nightstand. The family could move through their home without navigating around the evidence of an elderly man's limitations and needs. "Son, sometimes love means giving people the space they need to build the life they deserve. Sometimes family means supporting each other from a distance instead of suffocating each other with proximity." Whoa. As they left the Crown Heights apartment together, Samuel carrying his 2 small suitcases, Damon carrying the guilt and relief of difficult decisions, Samuel felt something he hadn't experienced since his stroke had stolen his independence. The sense that his future was his own to determine, even if the options were limited and the resources were inadequate. The temporary housing arrangement wasn't perfect. The studio apartment was small, the neighborhood was unfamiliar, and the challenges of living independently with post-stroke limitations would require adjustments and accommodations that Samuel wasn't sure he could manage. But it was his space, his choice, his attempt to rebuild dignity that had been eroded by 18 months of being an unwanted burden in someone else's home. 6 months later, Samuel Washington would be sitting in his own small apartment, having learned to navigate Brooklyn's senior services network, having built relationships with neighbors who provided informal support without resentment, having discovered that independence looked different at 62 than it had at 40, but was still possible with creativity and determination. He would see his grandchildren every other weekend, his relationship with Damon strengthened by distance that allowed love to flourish without the daily friction of competing needs and limited resources. Keisha would send Christmas cards signed with respect and appreciation, acknowledgement that their conflict had been about circumstances rather than character. But that reconciliation lay in the future. Today, Samuel Washington simply walked away from the apartment, where he'd learned that being unwanted was sometimes the first step toward reclaiming the dignity that had been slowly eroded by dependency, and that sometimes the most loving thing a family member can do is give everyone the space they need to remember why they chose to love each other in the first place. The Brooklyn winter was still bitter, still unforgiving, but Samuel faced it as a man making his own choices rather than accepting other people's limitations as the boundaries of his existence. And for the first time in 18 months, that felt like enough.